kind of the last thing I think I remember saying to my wife last night as I was getting ready to doze off was, well, I have something to be thankful for. Tomorrow is my last sermon in this series, and so I'll be through with Paul for a while.
Okay.
So one could say that that's something to be thankful for. It's interesting to me that a few of you have said to me, as we've walked through this series of sermons, it's not about will, it's all about grace. That you have begun seeing that concept, the tension between law and rules and being made in a certain way in order to be a part of the community, contrasted with the concept of grace, that we live by grace, knowing that it's not about what we get done, it's not about rules that we make up and observe, but it's about what God is doing that is most significant. And I'm glad to hear that that's a conversation that has begun for some of you, and I'm sure will continue. I'm a huge fan of writer Ann Tyler. I love Ann Tyler. I just think if you put Ann Tyler together with anything Baltimore and Barry Levinson and the media together with anything Baltimore, you just can't go wrong. She is absolutely wonderful. And one of her books that I truly enjoyed was a book called Saint Maybe. It was one of three of her movies that got turned into, three of her books that got turned into movies, two by the Hallmark folk. Back when Hallmark was making something besides Christmas movies.
Really?
The protagonist is Ian. Ian is in this family, a loving family, a caring family. He is irritated when we get in the opening of the book because he doesn't like his sister-in-law. And he's asked to babysit. He's in college. He really wants to be with his female friend. And consequently, when his brother runs late, he chooses to share what he believes to be a true family secret about his sister-in-law. Now, I'm not going to tell you all of this. I'm just starting out so you get the context. And you'll have to go out and discover the joy of Ann Tyler for yourselves. As it turns out, the family secret was wrong. But what happens as a result of the sharing with his brother, and there's some ambiguity here, apparently commits suicide. Which leads to his sister-in-law slowly killing herself with drugs. And now there are children left. He's just lost. He's overwhelmed with guilt. He doesn't know what to do with it. And so he's walking downtown and he walks by a storefront and he hears singing. And somehow he's drawn into the singing, and it turns out to be a religious group. And feeling this overwhelming sense of guilt, he's sitting to the back trying to be unnoticed, and afterwards he engages in conversations with the pastor. And he hears there a word that he needs to hear, that all of us every Sunday need to hear, which is what the words of assurance are about. And that is, he hears the pastor say to him that he is forgiven. But then the pastor comes back around and says, I don't remember the exact dialogue, so I won't even try, but in essence, but it doesn't mean that you don't have responsibility. So Ian now sitting there, he has heard with some assurance that he's forgiven, but now there's the weight of that last instruction. It doesn't absolve you of responsibility. Consequently, Ian drops out of college, much to his parents' dismay. He gets a job, and he starts the process of raising the children. And you almost buy into some kind of works righteousness. Oh, he's working out his salvation. He's working out his redemption. But it's not exactly that, because it is through fulfilling his responsibilities. As you read the book, you'll find a character overwhelmed with grace. The fulfilling of the responsibilities, in this case, for Ian, was just another avenue to experience grace in a greater way. People have said to me in other churches, "You preach too much grace." There was a woman who used to get so mad at me in Dallas. She was working on her doctorate. We had a lot of those folk coming through seminary. You know, seminarians are always a pain in the, well, just fill in the blank. Because they're always sure they know more than you do, and they're usually right. I mean, after all, when I was in seminary, I knew more than my pastor. Well, for a while. She was mad because she felt like in preaching grace, people were allowed to be off the hook too easily for their sin. Paul is writing to the church of Galatia, and over again, because these Judaizers have been the source of trouble, insisting that people must be circumcised. They must be like the Jews in order to be truly Christian. A message that contraindicates all that Paul had been preaching there before. And he's so out of sorts. And Paul is trying to drive this through as we get to the end of the letter. But there is that moment when he gets past the anger and he reverts to the Paul that we so recognize in some of the other letters. For in that moment, he becomes Paul the pastor. And he begins lifting up for them, admonishing them that there are responsibilities for which they are, there are responsibilities to which they are connected. And there's this dance that takes place, as one scholar has said, between the corporate and the personal. So he moves into this time of reminding them of their responsibilities. The corporate, for instance, to the church, restore a fallen one gently. And I am reminded of how many people through the years I have seen wander away from the church. And we, as the congregation, were too busy to sit and listen to their pain, be with them in that moment, hear what they had to say, to invite them back into the community in a caring, compassionate way. Well, I don't know that I want to hear that. They may criticize us. I don't know that I want to hear that. That may take too much time. Paul's reminding the people of Galatia, those churches, look, when somebody falls away, be there for them. Care for them. Pretty good admonition for responsibility, I think. Then to the personal. Watch yourselves, kind of. In other words, you take care of yourselves. You watch what you're up to. Watch what you're doing. In other words, you be responsible as individuals. The corporate. Carry each other's burdens. You know, this church, I got to say this. After the survey, I hate to say anything positive about you because you already think highly of yourselves. But I think highly of you too. This church is the best I've ever pastored anywhere at any time. Well, wait a minute. You didn't hear the caveat. You're the best at eating. No. You are the best at finding ways to support each other in the hard places. Those of you who have experienced surgery and have had offers of meals, those of you who have grieved, who have been invited out to eat and people offering to be available to you, those of you who have walked through the time of grief and the church has ministered to you through service and reception. And I mean, there is a compassion here that's intense and quite wonderful. So I need to take that moment to say, Paul may be preaching to the folk in Galatia about bearing one another's burdens. And it's what we really are as a church about. But I do have appreciation that you have already heard that somewhere along the way, perhaps by preachers better than myself, because you know what to do. Okay? Then we come back to the individual. Each one should test his or her own action to carry his or her own load. Self-reflection. What am I doing? Am I being responsible in this community? Am I following the way, so to speak? The corporate. Share all good things with your teacher. I can think through the years of all the teachers that I should have thanked, but they mostly were just thanked by seeing me move on to the next grade. I'm sure they were filled with gratitude that I wasn't going to be back there. In college and in seminary, only one professor that I really kind of keep up with, and I had him in college where he got fired, and then I had him later in seminary where he got rehired or hired. I'm sure he was glad that he'd come to some place where he was going to see me again. But I made it a point, and still have occasional emails, to say to him the ways in which he impacted my spiritual journey and life. Because not all teachers hear that. Those of you who have taught know that. Usually, you're likely to hear a complaint rather than a thank you. But there are those who have impacted us, and it's important for us to be able to say to them, to share good things with them. The corporate, share all good. The individual, do not be deceived. One reaps what one sows. I don't want to dwell on that. I ate a big piece of German chocolate cake last night, and I knew that I was going to have night sweats, and sure enough, I did. Wonderful gift that I paid a price for. I should have eaten a smaller piece, and I'd have been fine. Do good. Do good, especially to family of believers. You see the dance. So Paul has become the pastor again. And then we have a shift. See what large letters I'm writing to you. And I grew up with preachers saying this is Paul's infirmity and he's probably got bad eyesight or this or that and the other. I don't think that's what this is about. I think what this is really about is that oftentimes people who were writing these letters would have folk who were doing kind of an unofficial stenographer, if you will. And they would take down these letters and they would be circulated to the churches oftentimes. I think what Paul wants the people in Galatia to hear is that, hey, I've switched on my capital letters. And I'm saying this to you in person. I'm writing this down with my own hand. So this is important. This you'd better pay attention to. And then Paul comes back at the Judaizers. You know, he's got to come back at these people one more time. And he basically says that the Judaizers are motivated with an obsession for uniformity. He uses different language, but that's what it's about. That's what the church has always been about. We set up a series of rules that we want people to live by, and oftentimes they're about outward stuff. I grew up in a blue-collar church, but you know, in the 1950s, they had these rules where, the guys were supposed to wear a tie to church. That's how you're supposed to do. You're supposed to look that certain way. And while we didn't have any women, actually, they had enough money to buy hats. In many churches, like the First Church downtown, women were expected to wear hats, and in some uppity churches, even gloves. Uniformity. When you come to church, you're supposed to look a certain way. dress a certain way. Then there were religious traditions who said, oh, no, women can't cut their hair. Some of you may never heard that because they misread some of Paul's writings, by the way. Uniformity. I grew up in a church that says you can't dance, you can't drink, you can't play cards. In other words, I was told I could never have fun. Uniformity. We got to keep people, we got to keep people all the same. The Judaizers, from a religious standpoint, had the same thing going. We got to get these people circumcised. We need them to look like Jews. We need them to act a certain way. But Paul wants everybody to know that if you get the uniformity that you're looking for, oftentimes outward signs and appearances just cover up an inward rot. It's not about the authenticity of the selves involved or the community. It's just covering things up. You could you can pour perfume all over some things that stink, and you still got the same thing in the cat box. See what I'm saying? And then he's trying to associate with them that, you can go the way of these Judaizers, do what they want, you can play their game, and you can fit in, but you're not going to be following Jesus. You've been that way before these past weeks, right? This is all about, according to Paul, these people that want to boast about bringing you to a certain place and getting you to adapt a certain criteria by which to live. But for Paul, he's saying, this isn't about that. This isn't about what's important. In the cross of Christ, it's really about a new creation. Our becoming a new creation. Our seeing ourselves more clearly. Loving God more dearly. It is about being the people of God because of the love that Christ showed from the cross. And we are becoming always a new creation. Since this is the finale, then we kind of get into the last little bit where he talks about peace and mercy. Paul says, if you get it, if you're becoming a part of that new creation, there's peace and mercy. And we say, well, good gracious, Paul. Throughout the ages, people who have stood and they made their stands and they had integrity, they've paid incredible prices for that stand. Paul even says, I bear in my body the marks. And if you read Paul's story, you scratch your head and say, good gracious. I mean, after all, this is a guy that got struck blind. He got carried off and had to wait for somebody to come and touch him so the scales fell from his eyes. Next thing you know, he goes up and tells the disciples he's been converted. There's people there that want to beat him up and kill him, and so a planned escape is arranged. He goes off and suddenly he's locked up in a jail somewhere. But while he's in jail, some angel comes and opens the doors. He appeals to Caesar, to Rome, because he's a Roman citizen. He's on a ship. The ship wrecks. Next thing you know, he's out by a fire and he supposedly gets close to a snake and a poisonous snake bites him. How is that grace and peace? Paul's trying to say that if you experience that mercy and peace, you get clear about who you are, about God's grace being the centerpiece for Christian community, love and acceptance. If you get that, you're going to be responsible. That's why he was being pastoral at the beginning. You're going to know how to take care of each other. You're going to know how to act if you receive the grace of Christ and becoming that new creation. And then he closes as he would any pastoral letter. He uses the term and reminds us again that it's not about will, it's always about grace, because Paul says, what? The grace be unto you. Now, I don't know As I said a little earlier, I don't know about you, but Thanksgiving Day is a time for me where I thank God to no ends that I was raised in a tradition that sometimes missed the way, but blessed me with love of story. People who were imperfect, but even in their imperfection, graced someone like myself. And in that community and in churches throughout my life, I have experienced the richness of people who, through the eyes of God, saw something in me that through much of my life I was never able to see in myself. We, the community gathered, look into your eyes. And whether you have gotten to the point of being able to see that or not, we see in you the image of God. And we see in you that you are a child of God, made incredibly unique, made as an act of love, molded and always being molded by God's wondrous Spirit. So I'm going to put aside this Thanksgiving a lot of the sentimental cliches that we come up with. And I'm going to take some time during that day to get to the side and whisper as strongly as I could whisper, thank you, God. It's not about will or anything that I can do. It's always about grace and your love that comes to me in a myriad of ways. That is what good Thanksgiving, I think, looks like for any of us who have experienced it in the depth of our being. Thanks be to God, now and always.